With the U.S.'s entry into the war, it was accepted that more escort carriers were needed, and fast. In January of 1942, Long Island was already in service, but was clearly only useful for training and transporting aircraft. Charger had already been reacquired by the Navy and would soon be commissioned, but was clearly only a little better. The upcoming Bogues were looking to be promising, but being converted while under construction meant they would take a while. Also, since they were conversions of C-3 merchant hulls, their size meant they would be necessarily limited in their capacities. To add to the problem, many were slated for transfer to the Royal Navy. More merchant ships could be added to the conversion program, but again, they'd be limited, and doing so would stymie the vital merchant fleet by biting too far into its numbers. The answer was tankers. 4 T-3 tankers, all that could be spared, that had already been taken over by the Navy as fleet oilers the previous year, were chosen to be converted into escort carriers in early 1942, about the same time the Independence-class light carriers began their conversion. These became the 4 ships of the 11,500-ton Sangamon class. By choosing these large and robust hulls, the Navy struck gold. Their sheer size meant they could be converted quickly from already finished ships and still be able to operate more and larger aircraft than other escort carriers, even as many as the light carriers. Additionally, they could still function as fleet oilers. Alternatively, they could remain at sea much longer than any other escort carrier without needing refueling. Their width, length, and weight lent to a long, wide, and stable flight deck and hangar that made aircraft operations easier than other escort carriers or even the light carriers. The strength of their hull meant they were hardy ships that could and did absorb relatively heavy damage compared to other escort carriers and survive. Again, originally planned without an island, a small Charger-style one was added during conversion. Their only arguable drawback was the engine room. Being converted from tankers, it was right at the vulnerable stern and had little subdivision. This was easily an acceptable trade-off for quickly acquiring 4 very capable escort carriers. Sangamon was started March 13, 1939 as ASO Trenton. On October 22, 1940, she was taken over by the Navy and commissioned the next day as the fleet oiler Sangamon. On February 25, 1942, she began conversion to an escort carrier and was recommissioned in that role August 25, 1942. Swanee was started June 3, 1938 as Marquet. On June 26, 1941, she was taken over by the Navy and commissioned July 16, 1941 as the fleet oiler Swanee. On February 21, 1942, she began conversion to an escort carrier and was recommissioned in that role September 24, 1942. Shenango was started July 10, 1938 as ASO New Orleans. On May 31, 1941, she was taken over by the Navy and commissioned June 20, 1941 as the fleet oiler Shenango. On March 16, 1942, she began conversion to an escort carrier and was recommissioned in that role September 19, 1942. Santee was started May 31, 1938 as ASO CK. On October 18, 1940, she was taken over by the Navy and commissioned October 30, 1940 as the fleet oiler Santee. On February 25, 1942, she began conversion to an escort carrier and was recommissioned in that role August 24, 1942. Main armament was initially 2 5-inch 51 caliber low-angle guns in single open mounts, one under each rear corner of the flight deck. Propulsion was provided by 4 boilers venting to 4 funnels, 2 on each side near the stern. These provided steam to 2 turbines. These produced 13,500 horsepower and each drove one of the 2 shafts for a top speed of about 18 knots. They had 1 rudder. The flight deck was 502 feet by 85 feet and had 1 portside catapult. There were 2 34-foot by 42-foot elevators. The hangar was 198 feet by 69 feet by 17.5 feet. aircraft complement was initially 12 Wildcat fighters, 9 Dauntless dive bombers, and 9 Avenger torpedo planes. Later, this was changed to 24 Wildcats and 9 Avengers. Modifications were standard for their type. The 2 5-inch 51s were traded for 2 single 5-inch 38 dual-purpose guns in single open mounts. Radar was fitted and upgraded throughout their lives, along with the number and quality of light and medium anti-aircraft guns. After completing conversion and trials, all 4 took part in the invasion of North Africa until mid-November 1942, when they headed back to the East Coast for overhaul in preparation for transferring to the Pacific. Minus Santee, which spent all of 1943 patrolling the Atlantic, they arrived in the Solomons in mid-January 1943 and supported the campaign there until heading to the West Coast and overhaul in September. Returning in late October, they took part in the Gilbert's invasion in November. Next, they took part in the invasion of the Marshall Islands at the start of 1944. While doing so, on January 25, 1944, a landing fighter missed the arresting wire and crashed into a group of parked planes on Sangamon. The result was a massive fire that raged for 2 hours before being brought under control. With temporary repairs made, they continued to cover the invasion until nearly the end of February before returning to Pearl Harbor for repairs and upkeep. In mid-March 1944, now joined by Santee, they headed back to the Southwest Pacific to take part in finishing off the New Guinea campaign in April. Next came supporting the liberation of the Marianas in June and July. In the third quarter of 1944, they covered the liberation of the Moluccas. In mid-October, they set out for the long-awaited liberation of the Philippines and the Battle of Leyte Gulf. As part of Taffy 1, early on the morning of October 25th, minus Shenango, which was on a ferry run to get more aircraft, they quickly diverted their planes to aid Taffy 3, which was under attack by the Japanese Center Force. At about 7:40 a.m., however, it was Taffy 1's turn, as it became the target of the first official kamikaze strike of the war. Santee was the first hit when a plane crashed through her flight deck and exploded in her hangar, starting a deadly fire. 15 minutes later, she was hit by a submarine torpedo that caused a 6-degree list. Emergency damage control took nearly 2 hours. At 8:03, Suwanee was hit just in front of the rear elevator by a plane that blew a 10-foot hole in her flight deck and a 25-foot gash in her hangar. Fires erupted from bow to stern, and it took 2 hours to contain them and restart air operations. The next day, another plane hit Suwanee that started another large fire. On the 29th, now rejoined by Shenango, they finally retired, eventually returning to the West Coast. With repairs and overhaul finally completed, they returned to the front in mid-March of 1945 to prepare for and take part in the invasion of Okinawa. While there, on April 9th, a landing fighter on Shenango crashed into parked planes and started a large fire. It was quickly put out, though, and she stayed in the fight. On the evening of May 4th, Sangamon was hit by a kamikaze that knocked out both of her elevators and started massive fires. Eventually returning to the East Coast in mid-June, repairs were started, but at the end of the war she was deemed not worth repairing, sold back into merchant service, and eventually scrapped. The other 3 in the meantime remained off Okinawa until mid-June, when Suwanee sailed to Borneo to support landings there, and Shenango escorted a convoy of tankers to and from the West Coast for the rest of the war. Santee was still at Okinawa on July 7th, when she also had a landing plane crash into a group of parked aircraft that started a fire. Repairs and training would keep her out of the rest of the war. Returning to Okinawa in early July, Suwanee spent the rest of the war there preparing for the invasion of Japan. Post-war, after about 15 years in reserve, the remaining 3 were finally sold for scrap.